Don Fire was sitting on the cold floor of his cell. With his hands, he slowly touched the collar that clung tightly to his neck. The metal was smooth and strangely warm, despite the biting cold of the dungeon. The collar was equipped with injectors and control systems, and this device reminded him that Don was just one of millions of slaves captured by cruel aliens. He didn't know how much time had passed since his enslavement. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into endless months. At some point, he just accepted it. He resigned himself to the fact that he would never see the sun again, would not hear the jokes of his fellow Marines. Don ran his hand along the edge of the collar as the door to his cell opened with a loud hiss. The clang of locks broke the echoing silence of the dungeon. A creature appeared in the doorway. The creature was tall, thin, with elongated limbs that quivered strangely with every movement. His skin was covered with a layer of shiny scales, shimmering with blue and grey colours. The creature's head was massive. Its eyes were completely black, without pupils, which made its gaze dead, inhuman. Instead of a mouth, there was something resembling claws that gnashed as they moved, emitting a crunchy, unpleasant sound. Don felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. The creature stood on the threshold, not moving, but its presence seemed to fill the entire cell, making Don feel even smaller and more helpless. Suddenly, a voice rang in his head. "Get out!" The voice was alien, harsh, like metal scraping against glass. Don shuddered, looking around, but the voice sounded right inside his mind. He remained sitting, clutching his knees, not moving. The voice was repeated, this time louder, more jerky. "Get out!" The collar around his neck flared up. The metal began to vibrate, and weak electricity surged into the skin. The pain was bearable, but it was a warning. Don knew that if he slowed down, the next discharge would be much stronger. He got to his knees, grinding his teeth in frustration. "Well, to hell with you," he breathed through clenched teeth. On all fours, Don crawled to a narrow manhole in the corner of the cell. It was impossible to leave through the doors. Don did not know the reason, but he tried at first, when he was still full of strength and could relax a little. The manhole was cramped and dark, its edges rough, as if hewn from stone, and a faint, dim light flickered in the distance. The electricity in the collar continued to crackle, urging him on. He felt like the device was ready to shock him at any second if he slowed down. The manhole was so narrow that he could barely squeeze through. His shoulders rubbed against the walls, and his knees were covered with abrasions on the rough surface with every movement. His mind began to sink into memories. Don recalled the day when he was still a Marine, how he and his squad took the first blow of the invasion, how creatures like this fell into the ocean from huge ships hovering in the sky and began to hunt people. They rounded up the survivors in huge crowds in open areas. It was hell. Pure hell. He remembered how he stood in the last battle, how his comrades screamed as they were torn apart by these creatures. He remembered how he ended up among the hundreds of thousands of people who were kicked into these underground chambers, turning into slaves. He was alone now. Once again, he had to obey, crawl forward, into nowhere, as if he were an insignificant puppet in the hands of those who looked at people as prey. Suddenly, the collar flared up again. An electric shock hit him in the neck, and for a moment everything went dark before his eyes. The pain made him move faster, climb despite the scratches and pain in his arms and knees. There was a low rumble behind him. The creature wasn't moving, but he could feel its gaze. Those black eyes were looking straight into his soul, as if they controlled his every move. Don crawled on, not looking back. Don crawled like an animal, clutching at the rough walls with bloody fingers. His body moved automatically, driven by the pulling pain in his neck from the collar. The hole was short, but that didn't make it any easier. When he got out, a narrow corridor opened up in front of him, cut right into the ground. The hallway was low and oppressively cramped. Its walls of black stone emitted a faint glow, as if the walls themselves were alive. This glow gave a ghastly hue to everything that was around. The floor underfoot is damp, with traces of dirt and blood, as if thousands of bare feet had already passed through here before. One step, one more step, and suddenly, from a side branch, very close to him, a figure appeared. It was a man, a naked man, terribly thin. His ribs stuck out like knives, and his skin was grey and scarred. His face looked empty, and his eyes were bleary, as if his life had long since left him. The man didn't pay any attention to Don. He just walked out of the aisle and started walking forward down the corridor. And then it started. One by one, people began to emerge from the dark side passages. Men, women, teenagers. They came out slowly, without emotion, like automatons, with only one desire: to move forward. Many of them were emaciated to the point where their bodies resembled caricatures of human forms. Pale skin, wounds, dried blood. There is nothing in their eyes. Emptiness. Footsteps echoed loudly in the hallway. Don walked without looking back, but he could feel the line of people forming into one endless stream behind him. Hundreds, thousands. They moved in silence, with their heads down. The smell of sweat, blood, and rot was in the air, enveloping this eerie process. He didn't know where their creatures were leading them. Maybe for new experiments. Maybe to creepy factories where their bodies were processed into something incomprehensible. There were no answers, just footsteps echoing in the hallway. Thoughts. Don allowed himself to lose himself in thought for a while. Images of how it all started came back to his mind. He remembered the battle alarms that had sounded throughout the base. Radio communications filled with panicked messages. "Objects over the Atlantic! Attention, they're coming down! Fire! Fire!" He remembered how the fighters took off, how they fired missiles that exploded uselessly on the force fields of alien ships. I remembered how armored vehicles disappeared under the volleys from the sky. He was there, on the front line, when the entire might of the US Armed Forces broke down with a bang in 11 hours. "It's 11 o'clock. It took so many alien creatures to destroy what humans had been building for centuries. Air defense systems, aircraft, tanks, even nuclear weapons. Nothing helped. These creatures possessed technologies that humans couldn't even comprehend. They turned off the power, disabled the mechanisms. Their ships didn't just fly. They hovered over cities, eclipsing the sun, slowly burning out life itself from the surface. Now the entire coast, the entire Atlantic region, has been turned into an underground concentration camp. Millions of people disappeared into these dark catacombs, becoming slaves, test subjects, or just victims. "What about Russia?" flashed through Don's mind. "China? Europe?" But he immediately dismissed these thoughts. The answer was obvious. If such a fate had befallen America, then the rest of the world would not have been able to withstand even the little that his homeland had managed. Even if there were still pockets of resistance somewhere, their fate was sealed. These creatures did not come for war. They came to take this world. Don felt despair like a black pit growing in his chest. His life turned into a nightmare. Here, in these dungeons, death was not a deliverance, but a salvation that was not given to anyone. Step! Step! Behind them, more and more people were coming out of the side corridors. Their breathing, the rustle of bare feet on the dirty floor, barely audible moans, all this merged into one depressing symphony. He walked without turning around, thinking about how this world was lost. The corridor gradually narrowed, turning into a low gallery, and then into a tunnel. The solid stone walls were suffused with oppressive warmth, as if the depths of the earth were slowly preparing to devour people. The air was heavy, musty, filled with dust, and an alien smell that could not be identified. Don, like everyone else, was no longer walking, but crawling again. The manhole became narrower and steeper. Its curves made the man bend, as if he were trying to pass through the eye of a needle. Every inch was difficult. Behind him, he could hear rustling and soft moans as people crawled after him in an endless chain. Some moved faster, others slower, and from time to time there was a thud as someone fell, exhausted. But the traffic didn't stop. Those who were behind continued to crawl forward, without stopping, without hesitation, without even noticing what was happening to the fallen. When Don looked back, he saw one of the men crawling behind him right over the body of the woman who had collapsed moments earlier. He didn't even stop. His hands and knees pressed down on her body, and it made a disgusting crunch. No one looked back. The woman was no longer moving. The others just continued on their way, turning her remains into a shapeless mess. "It's not people, it's mechanisms," flashed through Don's mind. But he immediately dismissed the thought. No, these are people just like him. It's just that everyone has only one goal left: to move forward. An hour later, or maybe more, the manhole began to expand. Finally, a faint light appeared ahead. Don got out into a huge room that could hardly be called a hall. It was a giant tunnel, extending several kilometers deep. The walls were covered with a strange organic coating, emitting a faint red glow that illuminated the vast space. This whole area was right under the ocean, deep under the Atlantic coast. Don looked up. Water dripped from the ceiling, mixing with the sweat and blood exuded by the exhausted people. The air here was thick and humid, like in a giant steam bath. "God, it's hot in here!" There were strange aggregates lying on the ground, similar to weapons, but with a completely alien design. Their shape was angular, with many metal tubes and projections glowing scarlet. These devices projected thin red lasers that had to be used to chisel the rock. The stone was difficult to work with, and in order to extract minerals from it, it was necessary to work with incredible physical exertion. Alien technology! People, naked and exhausted, picked up these devices and started working. Some fell immediately, as weakness and final exhaustion took their toll, but others took their place. Don took one of the units. The metal burned his hands, but he ignored it. Guided by the collar, he went to the wall and turned on the laser. A thin scarlet ray flashed, and the stone in front of him began to slowly crumble, emitting acrid smoke. Don began to hammer at the rock, feeling every movement take away the remnants of his strength. "Hey, kid!" said a hoarse voice nearby. Don turned around. A plump, elderly man addressed him. His skin was covered with a layer of dirt. His hair was grey and matted, and his eyes were sunk deep into his skull, surrounded by bruises. There was an expression of both horror and resignation on his face. "Do you think they'll ever let us go?" the man asked. His voice sounded hollow, as if he was talking to the void. Don looked at him. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he just turned away and continued to chisel the rock. Don, still hammering at the stone wall, looked at the man again. His face seemed vaguely familiar, but at the same time hazy, like a memory from a long-forgotten dream. He had seen those features somewhere, heard that voice. "Do we know each other?" he blurted out before he had time to think about his words. The man stopped for a moment, putting the strange machine on the ground. His face twisted into a grim smile filled with bitterness. "The whole of America knows me," he said, leaning against the wall. "I used to host a talk show. He helped people figure out fatherhood issues. DNA tests, that's it." Don froze. Now he remembers. It was the same male star of evening television whose show was watched by millions. Don had seen him on the screen a couple of times in his youth, when he was still living with his parents. Back then, life seemed simple, and this man was just a funny face on a TV screen. The man seemed to read his mind and added with a hollow laugh, "You know, back then, I thought I'd seen the worst. Families were destroyed because of those tests. Children were left without fathers. And now look at what's left of these families." Don didn't say anything. He just continued to hammer at the wall, feeling his hands start to shake with fatigue. But the man wasn't going to shut up. "A Marine, huh? What is it?" he asked suddenly, nodding at the barely visible tattoo on Don's shoulder, which flashed with every movement he made. Don glanced at him briefly and just nodded silently. "Well, what are you guys doing?" the man said, lowering his eyes. "They couldn't protect us." Those words hit Don harder than any pain he had endured in recent months. He wanted to say something, to justify himself, but he knew he couldn't. It was all true. They couldn't. No one could. The man leaned against the wall again, sighed heavily, and added softly, "You know, here. There are no such creatures here. None of them. They don't walk among us. They don't follow. These collars do all the work for them. If you need a charge, the collar will give. If death is needed, they just press the button." He ran his hand over his neck, as if trying to remove an imaginary noose. "They don't even consider us worthy of their attention. We're like ants to them. Only the ants are useful, working for them." Don was silent, but his thoughts were torn apart. "But the scariest thing is not here," the man continued. His voice became quieter, as if he was afraid that someone was eavesdropping. "I've seen what they do to people on the upper levels." Don stopped and looked up. The question came out of his mouth. "What are they doing?" The man stared at him for a long time, as if debating whether to tell him. But then his face distorted, and he began to speak softly. They're cutting us up. But these are not just experiments, not just the anatomy. They study what makes us human. Body, nerves, brain, heart. But that's not enough for them. The man swallowed convulsively and looked at the floor. "They want to take out of us what makes us. Us. Do you understand? They want to find where the soul is hidden." Don frowned, his fingers curling around the handle of the device. "A soul?" The man nodded, his eyes filled with horror. "Yes. They dissect people, check how emotions work. They are connected to some kind of machines that make a person feel fear, pain, love, rage, all at once. And they look at how it tears us apart from the inside. They're trying, delete it, remove us from us." "And then what?" Don asked, although the answer was already clear to him. "Later? Then it's not a person anymore. An empty shell. Without life, without thoughts. They make us dead, leaving our bodies alive." The man suddenly sank to the ground, clutching his head in his hands. "I saw it. I saw them coming back. People I knew. They no longer looked into each other's eyes, did not speak. They just moved like machines and died in a few hours." Don turned away, his heart pounding. The silence of the tunnel suddenly seemed even heavier. Only the sound of the laser and the faint moans from the depths of the tunnel reminded him that he was still alive. "I also heard they have incubators where Earth women give birth to offspring. They need slaves to dig these dungeons." Don didn't know how much time had passed. In this hell, where there was no light, no sound, no life, it lost all meaning. There were no clocks in the dungeons, and the alternation of day and night had long since become a distant myth, which he hardly remembered anymore. The only time markers were the injections from his collar. Every half hour, A tiny needle would stick into his neck, and he could feel an icy wave spreading through his veins. Chemistry. Burning, nasty, but giving strength to move on. He couldn't remember the last time he had drunk or eaten. Maybe a few days ago. Maybe weeks. It didn't matter anymore. His body had long since ceased to be his property. It now belonged to these creatures. They replaced everything that had once made him human. Hunger and thirst have become unnecessary concepts. The body was fed by their chemistry injected into the blood. It was not a life, but a parody of existence, supported by an alien force. Back in the cell, Don collapsed on the cold stone floor. His hands were shaking. The skin on his palms was torn to the flesh after his shift, and his knees burned from the endless friction against the stone in the holes. He didn't know what was happening to him. He didn't feel time, pain, or himself. He just fell down, burying his face in the dirty floor, and closed his eyes. But sleep did not bring relief. He had never really slept, and his mind was racing between anxious half-dreams and brief flashes of painful memories. Every half hour, the injection shook his body. At first he hated the feeling, the sharp prick, the cold, sticky pulse in his veins, and then the surge of strength, as if someone was recharging his internal batteries. It felt more like torture than help. But now he was waiting for this injection as a salvation. Without it, he would have died a long time ago, and sometimes he cursed this technology for not allowing him to go into oblivion. At some point, his consciousness was plunged into complete darkness. He didn't even know if he was asleep or just passed out. A voice suddenly rang out, snapping him out of unconsciousness. "Crawl out." Don opened his eyes and felt the collar come alive. The metal vibrated slightly, warning him not to delay. He stood up, leaning on his hands. His body ached as if it had been run over by a tank, but the fear of the collar discharging made him move. He got down on all fours and began to slowly crawl towards the narrow manhole that led out of the cell. This time, something was different. The movement in the hole seemed infinitely lonely. There were no sounds, no moans from the other prisoners, just his own footsteps and his breathing echoing in the narrow space. An eerie silence reigned around, interrupted only by the hum of distant machinery. When he got out into the hallway, there were already 5 people standing there. 2 men, 2 women, and a teenage boy of about 15, too thin to look real. Their faces were grey, lifeless, like those of puppets controlled by invisible strings. None of them made a sound. No one was shy about nudity. They stood with their heads submissively lowered, like shadows. Don looked around at them, but no one met his gaze. He didn't say anything. Over the months, he had gotten used to the silence. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps was heard. Heavy, loud, measured. Those footsteps sounded far away, but they were getting closer. Don and 5 others were ordered by voices to move forward, and they obeyed. This time, their path did not lead downwards like before. The corridors through which they were being chased became wider and cleaner. The walls were no longer damp and covered with mold. Now they were smooth, metallic, with a barely noticeable bluish glow that seemed so alien that it made my stomach ache. A huge platform appeared ahead, towering in the center of the circular room. Elevator. Don froze for a moment, feeling anxiety flare up inside. Previously, they were always sent down into the deepest tunnels, but now they're being led upstairs. The elevator looked like a smooth metal disc, with thin lines of light coming from it. As they approached, the platform began to vibrate softly, filling the air with a low hum. Don felt his chest constrict. He suddenly found it hard to breathe, and cold sweat began to trickle down his back. He glanced at the boy who was standing next to him. He was looking at the elevator with a strange expression, as if trying to figure out what was waiting for them. The others were silent. No one asked any questions. No one tried to resist. As the platform began to rise, Don closed his eyes. He didn't want to see where they were being lifted. After a long, exhausting climb, the platform froze with a dull, metallic sound. An hour passed, but it seemed like forever. The air has changed. It has become lighter, cleaner. Don opened his eyes, and the bright light that fell on him made him close his eyes. He raised his hand, covering his face with his palm, but he still felt the pain in his eyes. The voice in my head rang out again sharply and indisputably. "Go ahead." He obeyed. His legs, which had barely been able to support him until recently, moved mechanically. The other 5, who had been climbing with him, walked behind, equally confused and blind from the unaccustomed light. The corridor they were taken to was nothing like the damp, rot-soaked tunnels below. Everything was shining here. Smooth white walls, smooth metal floor, bright light that came from somewhere above. The space seemed sterile, unnatural, frightening in its purity. Don moved forward, feeling his legs tremble, but he didn't stop, and suddenly he saw them. People. Real people standing in the middle of the hallway. They were dressed in military uniforms, dirty, tattered, but still recognizable. One of them was missing an arm. The empty sleeve of his jacket was hanging from the side. They were armed. Don saw the submachine guns held by 2 of them, and the bright vests behind which the armor was discernible. It took him a moment to believe what he was seeing. His gaze darted from one to the other. They were real people, not machines, not shells that he had seen before. Their eyes shone with understanding, awareness. They looked at him and the others with an expression that was hardly friendly, and there was strength in their faces. One of them stepped forward. A tall man with thick grey hair and a creepy fresh scar running across his face from forehead to chin. He looked stern, but his eyes sparkled with something akin to mockery. The man chuckled, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Private Don Rivez, for fuck's sake! I didn't expect that. Welcome." The voice, hollow and low, like a blow, snapped Don out of his stupor. He blinked, feeling a chill run down his spine. How does he know my name? It took him a few seconds to recognize it. When the memory surfaced in his mind, it struck like lightning. This man was his instructor, a sergeant at a training camp in Idaho. Don couldn't believe his eyes. He froze, feeling the world begin to spin around him. "First Sergeant Calder?" he gasped. The words were coming out with difficulty. His throat was dry. The man nodded and grinned even wider, his face contorted into a grimace that looked more like an evil grin. "Found out, huh? Well, finally." Don opened his mouth to ask a question, but his thoughts were too confused. He didn't understand what was going on. Are you a prisoner too?" "What is it?" he finally asked, barely realizing what he had said. Calder laughed. The laugh was short and rough, and it gave Don goosebumps. The man shook his head as if at a stupid child. "No, kid, not a prisoner. You're a prisoner." He took a step closer, leaning forward slightly, his face level with Don's. "It's just that our government has changed. Understood?" Those words cut harder than a knife. Don felt his insides tighten. Has the government changed? What does it mean? He looked at Calder, trying to find an explanation in his eyes, but all he found was cold certainty. "Do you work for them?" Don whispered, almost afraid to say it out loud. Calder straightened up, the smile fading from his face. His gaze became heavy and empty. "What would you do, kid? Did you resist to the last? Died like a hero?" He glanced at the other people behind Don. "Look at them. Look at yourself. Heroes don't live long." Don felt his breath catch in his throat. He felt like he was falling, even though his feet were still standing in place. There was only one word in my head. Betrayal. Calder laughed, his laugh loud, dry, and hollow, as if it were echoing through the void. He threw his head back, showing everyone his terrible scar for a moment, and then looked at Don with contempt and a barely noticeable hint of mockery. "I'm not going to ask you to join our little squad, Private," he said, still grinning. "Do you know why? Because we're going to die soon too." Don froze, peering into the former instructor's face. Those words hit harder than a direct blow. Calder continued, gesturing at the people around him. "Do you see them? These soldiers? We're all here. We are the best of the best. Special forces, Marines, pilots, whatever. But you know what? They're out there." He nodded somewhere in the direction where the bright light seemed almost blinding. "Not very concerned about our survival." His voice became quieter, almost thoughtful, as if he was talking to himself. "They don't care. We're all trash to them. We either work or we die. Sometimes, as I understand it, one thing turns into another." Don couldn't take his eyes off Calder. He wanted to say something, to ask, but his throat was constricted, not allowing him to get out a word. Calder suddenly turned to him, his eyes narrowed, and an icy light lit up in them. "However, you won't care about anything soon," he said through gritted teeth. His voice turned cold, sending a chill down Don's spine. A second later, Calder raised the pistol, which he had been holding loosely at his hip. He aimed it directly at Don. The faded light of the corridor reflected off the metal of the weapon, giving the whole scene an eerie inevitability. "The creatures are inviting you and them to experiment. Medical." Don felt a shudder run through his body. He wanted to step back, but his feet seemed rooted to the floor. The word experiment rang in his head, conjuring up the worst images of what could lie ahead. "Come on!" Calder shouted sharply, his voice no longer sounding like mockery. Now it was an order, cold and peremptory. Don didn't move. He couldn't. Calder's finger tightened on the trigger, and he said with icy malice, "Don't make me repeat myself." Don took a step forward, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. The other 5, silent and broken, followed him like puppets propelled by invisible strings. They walked forward towards the light, which was getting brighter and seemed as unnatural as everything around them. But this light did not bring hope. He was a harbinger of something much worse.